good. Yeah, thank you. Hey, thank you for doing this. You're up in, if I'm understanding, you're up in Canada. Is that right? Up in British Columbia?
Yeah, in Vancouver. That's my hometown. Yeah, that's where
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, welcome and thank you for joining. I think we've had some interesting discussion. Now you're at the Terry Fox Cancer Institute. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the BC Cancer Research Center, the Terry Fox lab within that, and that's a lab that investigates, some molecular cellular research on preventing and treating cancer. And our lab in particular, which is led by Dr. Jerry Crystal, focuses on the immunohistochemistry. And that's part of a study we're doing right now, looking at. It's a 3-year study in cooperation with Dr. Jeff Volek at the Ohio State University, looking at the therapeutic benefits of ketogenic diet for women with metastatic breast cancer.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about that. I just kind of remember because Terry Fox, for people who don't remember, was a Canadian athlete that lost his leg to, I don't know, I think it was an osteosarcoma. And I guess he ran across Canada on a prosthesis to raise awareness for cancer research. And he eventually succumbed and died of it. But that was just, I hadn't heard that name in many, many years. And so I remember there's a good movie about that if somebody wants to watch. But so you are a PhD, and what's your PhD is in what exact science?
My PhD is in biology, specifically mathematical biofluid dynamics. So like many people in the nutrition community, I came to nutrition a little bit more mid-career. I didn't start off that way. And in fact, I didn't start off looking at ketogenic diets. I started off looking at nutrition because I'm a health educator. I teach anatomy, physiology, contemporary health and pathology at a university here in the Vancouver area called the University of the Fraser Valley. And but my background is actually in biology. I did some work at Woods Hole in Cape Cod, and also I was at Cambridge University for 2 years in comparative physiology. So I define myself different ways depending on the audience, but I'm a nutrition researcher, but my background is in human physiology, and that's really what I teach.
So let's talk. So this is a kind of an interesting topic, because anytime you mentioned metastatic breast cancer, anytime you sort of mention diet in relation to cancer, I mean, it sets off all sorts of alarm bells. People get very upset. For some reason, cancer has sort of become almost deified in some way, to speak. That you can't. How dare you talk about cancer outside the terms of radiation, chemotherapy, and surgery, and anything else is considered heresy. So do you have how hard is it to do nutritional research on cancer and not be sort of attacked, I suppose?
Well, so far so good. I haven't really been attacked, but not personally. But as you know, the nutrition field is very contentious anyway. There's lots of theories and even some conspiracy theories about nutrition coming from a field of biology that was more focused on bench science, that you could make very accurate measurements in fluid dynamics. So this was something that was kind of new. It was all a bit mucky to me. But I think you're right. And the first thing we should say is that a ketogenic diet is not a cure for breast cancer. We don't have a cure for breast cancer. Will it help you prevent cancer? That is a challenge that's very difficult to prove. It's difficult to prove any nutritional intervention will prevent anything, and we can talk about why, but generally it's just really difficult to do studies with humans on nutrition because people have to eat, and so it's difficult to have those gold standard controlled randomized trials. So what we do in general in keto research, in the medical sense, is look at, or in health, is look at how we can treat disease. So presumably, if there's benefit for the diet treating cancer, then you could extrapolate that there would be benefit in preventing it as well. And the same thing would go for other chronic disease like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and the like. So with all of those, there's either strong or emerging evidence that there's some benefit to ketogenic diet. And so that's where we like to focus our research, because it's something that we can show even with gold. It's very expensive to do nutritional studies because you have to produce all the food for people and so on. But when you look at the changes in the biomarkers that physicians and researchers use to predict the likelihood of other chronic disease, we can see improvements in those biomarkers as well. Biomarkers being anything that goes from, blood pressure to blood sugar to, blood lipids or body measurements like relative fat mass as well. So we suspect, and there are a number of researchers that suspect that a ketogenic diet may be very beneficial in preventing cancers, but cancers are not all one thing. There's different types, and some cancers actually probably do better on a ketogenic diet, so it would be contraindicated. And we're seeing good results in early stage, small sample size trials to indicate that there's some therapeutic benefit in our case for women with metastatic breast cancer.
Yeah, let's, because you say, it's very difficult to do nutrition. As I'm somebody trying to organize nutritional studies, it's very expensive. And yes, there's so many confounders that you have to do there. And unless you're willing to sort of lock people in metabolic rewards, it's really challenging to sort of, know exactly what people are eating. So that's one. But, so if you say it's very difficult, why are we even going down this route? What is the evidence that's compelling us so far to say, hey, maybe this is got some efficacy in, I would say, modifying the course of cancer or perhaps preventing that? So what you talked about biomarkers. What does the literature show thus far that's giving you the drive to continue this research?
Well, if we sort of dial back a little bit and look at chronic disease, I sort of think that chronic disease is something that may have some common root causes. And I have many friends in medicine and that are physicians. I don't mean to disparage them, but much of medicine right now, the way it's practiced is to treat symptoms of diseases. So you have high blood pressure. Well, let's lower the blood pressure, but that's really a marker of some more serious conditions. So if you look at the root cause and the increase in incidence of conditions, especially after the last 40 years, they certainly correlate with the change in recommendations for what constitutes a healthy diet. From the U.S. food plate, from Health Canada, from others around the world, to eat, largely a very low-fat, high-carb diet. And I would argue that was the wrong turn, that there was never really any solid evidence, robust scientific evidence to suggest that lowering fat was a healthy thing to do. It was sort of forced through. It was an unproven paradigm that people forced through on the public through public policy. Back about the 80s is when we started with that. And if you look at the increase in incidence of obesity alone, that's increased dramatically. People have done pretty much what the guide says. They're eating mostly carbs and eating a lot of fat-free stuff and lowering protein consumption. Probably not this group, but in general in the public. And what that's done is led to a condition I call it the axis of illness. Which is a combination of obesity, which is a disease as defined in the United States in and of itself, and inflammation, and in particular, insulin resistance. So I think a lot of this chronic disease has to do with insulin resistance, and insulin is a very powerful hormone, probably the most significant hormone we have in our bodies. And it does a number of different things, and in particular, excessive amounts of insulin can result in the problems I just mentioned, obesity and inflammation, and those things all correlate. About 70% of all chronic disease is due to those three elements: obesity, which is in itself inflammatory and leads to insulin resistance; inflammation, which leads to insulin resistance and obesity; and insulin resistance, which leads to obesity and inflammation. So it's a kind of a triangular vicious circle, if you like, that makes itself worse. And this takes often decades to slowly affect our metabolism, our state of health, that eventually it becomes, a defined disease. So depending on what your symptoms are, it will be defined as diabetes. If it's uncontrolled blood sugar, it could be defined as cardiovascular disease. If it's uncontrolled blood pressure, or cancer if you start having tumors. Now we produce tumors all the time. Benign tumors, which are generally not life-threatening, and malignant tumors, which are. But our immune system is designed to detect those tumors when they're small and destroy them. We have a whole system, basically, of cytotoxic T cells and killer T cells that are designed to identify and destroy cancer cells before they cause any harm. So it's a bit of it's like an arms war almost. You have your immune system trying to keep you healthy, and yet we're compromising our immune system with our poor diet, and we're leaning things in favor of tumor growth, because one of the key effects of insulin is to promote growth of tissues, protein, and so on. And of course, cancer cells, everybody knows, are tissues that are growing very rapidly. So, and the other thing is that cancer cells, for the most part, most of the solid tumors that we know about, have this bias called the Warburg effect, which is that they can't metabolize through oxidative respiration, or OXPHOS, people call it. They're dependent on fermentation or glycolysis or anaerobic respiration. And so when you're on this high carbohydrate diet, that leads to chronically high levels of glucose in your blood. When you have high levels of glucose in your blood, you secrete insulin. So when you have chronically high glucose levels in your blood, you're going to have chronically high insulin levels in your blood. And there you have the two factors that promote tumor growth. You have insulin, which is a growth factor, and you have the food that cancer cells love, which is glucose. So the basic principle, Dr. Baker, of the ketogenic diet is we're just moderating those. We're not taking blood sugar down to zero. What we're doing through ketosis is providing another fuel, which is a much better fuel, I would argue, in terms of ketones for your brain, your heart, and the rest of your body. So we're moderating the amount of blood sugar, and because you're moderating your blood sugar, you're going to moderate your insulin levels. And so you're tipping that balance of power now in favor of your immune system being able to detect and destroy tumors. And so that's the basic principle. I hope it's not too sciencey, but it seems to work for the tumors we've been investigating in these preliminary small sample size studies. We're seeing regression of tumors, quite dramatic regression of tumors when people are put on a ketogenic diet, a very strict, well-formulated ketogenic diet.
Yeah, that, and what I see constantly, you talk about these benign growths, and I've seen people, the skin tabs, the acrocordons or the lipomas, and even, these leiomyomas that you see in women's uterine fibroids. I've seen all that regress by going on low carbs, ketogenics, or carnivorous diets. It's not surprising. I've talked with Thomas Seyfried, I'm sure you're familiar with his work.
Yes, very.
The belief that cancer is a somatic, a DNA mutation, he pushes back on that, so the evidence doesn't support that, because you have cancers where they don't have the same mutation, even within the same cancer. So, he claims, he believes that it's a metabolic problem, maybe a mitochondrial problem. Let me ask you about, because the brain uses a lot of ketones. I mean, when we make ketones, the brain is a major consumer, and we've seen a lot of success with ketogenic diets in brain tumors. So is there something to do with, because you say which tumors don't do well with the ketogenic diets? Does it have to do with the way the body partitions ketones and utilizes them naturally? Or what is the patterns you've seen? Which ones don't respond well to ketogenic diets, or get worse perhaps with that?
Well, again, the short answer is we don't know. I don't know offhand just yet. So cancer is, in some sense, the same thing, in that it's an uncontrolled growth. There's oncogenes that become activated, so that cells, instead of focusing on what they normally do, start doing things that they shouldn't do, and they spread and seed other tissues and interrupt the normal functioning of those tissues. But there's all different types of cancers. When I talk about solid tumors, that's supposed to say blood and lymphatic cancers, which are the blood cells and lymph cells. But if you want to look at the brain is quite interesting, because the brain, I learned when I was in physiology way back in the last century that the brain could only use glucose as a fuel, and that's what we decided. And we found out, in fact, some of the work in labs neighboring mine at the University of British Columbia had discovered that, in fact, the brain has another preferred fuel, which is the beta hydroxybutyrate, the main ketone that's produced. And that BHB actually enters the brain cell just down its concentration gradient. It can pass through the blood-brain barrier and be used as a fuel. And when it is used as a fuel in the brain, which of course is a very metabolically active organ, because it's essentially, a fat oxidation, it goes through, as opposed to, the standard anaerobic and then aerobic pathway, you get a lot less reactive oxygen species or oxidants being produced. So it has a greater efficiency and a lower burden on the brain, and not just cancer, but if you look at Alzheimer's disease, for example, you see this inflammatory response in the brain, and we see it mediated, and in fact, brain function improve, not just on a ketogenic diet, but even just taking, MCT oil, which provides that ketone. There's work being done at University of Sherbrooke right now using fMRIs, functional MRIs, to look at the brain of Alzheimer's patients while they're metabolizing these ketones, and the brain function improves quite dramatically. And that's just a couple of tablespoons of MCT oil a day. So I think, and this may speak to the community you have here. I think, first of all, I agree with what Dr. Seyfried is proposing, is that I think not just cancer, but I think all these diseases are metabolic diseases. I think when you have cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, by the way, having any one of them makes it more likely to have the other ones, which is another sort of key that I think of as it's a key sign that these have a common source or a common root cause. And I think that root cause is at the mitochondrial level. And I think in the next 10 years in research, you're going to see a lot more medical focus on mitochondrial health. Essentially, a ketogenic diet is a natural human diet. And if you're talking about a carnivore diet, one of the things I get, there are people that throw darts at people in the keto community. And one of the things they say is, well, we don't have enough long-term evidence. And I would argue, I don't know, I call 4 million years of evolution good long-term evidence. Somehow we got here without cornflakes and pizza. If you look at even people now on what were more natural diets, hunter-gatherer type diets, if there's meat around, they're going to eat meat. Because in fact, they're going to eat fat first before meat, because that's the high energy food. And that's, sorry to all the folks out there in the high carb community, but that's the way we're designed. And as a biologist and an evolutionary biologist, which was in my past, that's what comparative physiology is, by the way, looking at different species and seeing how organ systems develop. There's no question that we are adapted, or keto adapted naturally. And so when we talk about keto adaptation through diet, we're just going back to the way we should be eating. And when we do, as you've seen, and I'm sure a number of people in the community here have seen, your health improves. So, we can talk about this further if you like, but the most important lifestyle decision you make every day is what's on the end of your fork. Nutrition has more impact on your health than smoking, sedentary behavior, alcohol, all of that combined. If you're not eating healthy, you can be as healthy as you want the rest of your life. And as we say, you can't outrun your fork. You need to be careful about what's on the end of your fork, because that's going to be the major determinant, major lifestyle determinant of your health. Genetics, of course, playing another role. Those are the cards you're dealt. But I applaud you, Dr. Baker, for putting this community together, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there about nutrition. And we're in the midst of a paradigm shift where we're moving away from this flawed and now debunked model that a high carb, low fat diet was somehow supposed to be healthy for us. And people like yourself and others are pointing us in the direction of what should we be eating. And as I say, it's very hard to do the randomized controlled trials. They're very expensive. Our study is about $1 million for 20 women on each side, and that's over 3 years. So, if you're going to do a study that proves that a diet is going to prevent disease, you're going to have to get thousands of people to commit to eating the same food for 30 years and feed them that food and watch them and, basically, isolate them. So it's never going to be done. There isn't enough money on the planet. What we do know is they did spend, about $2 billion in adjusted dollars trying to prove that saturated fats cause heart disease. And I'm sorry, but that comes up empty. There is no robust evidence to indicate that saturated fats cause heart disease. I mean, there's better fats, obviously, but most of my diet, most of my calories probably come from saturated fats from animals, and I think that's the way we're designed to metabolize food. So what we're doing when we do that is we're keeping our mitochondria healthy. When we keep our mitochondria healthy, then those chronic disease symptoms seem to reverse. And this is most powerfully demonstrated in the really amazing results we've got in very long term now, up to 5 years, robust studies on diabetes type 2. And in a good 3/5 of people, we can completely reverse it. So, and remember, there's no drug or other intervention that reverses diabetes. All it does is slow that inexorable decline in type 2 diabetes that leads to an early death, and not a pleasant decline. But 60% of people will completely reverse their type 2 diabetes for years on a ketogenic diet. And of course, carnivore diets are by default ketogenic, but not all ketogenics are carnivore, but carnivore are ketogenic. Unless you just eat liver, if you just eat liver, there's a bit of glycogen in there. You might be throwing yourself out of ketosis, but I do eat liver. But I mean, obviously, you're not going to get a lot of carbohydrates just eating meat. And I've seen, anecdotally, I've seen people respond really well to carnivore diets, reversing Parkinson's, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I have as well, obviously. I want to ask you about, because you mentioned diabetes, and I think I think many people, at least in the low carb community, are well aware of that fact. Verta Health has done that. There's a Harvard study coming out on the carnivore diet, and I've seen some of the early data, and the diabetes reversal rates in that are also tremendous. I mean, they're just like almost everybody's getting rid of their diabetes. But let's talk about the cancer stuff, because I've heard, people talk about animal studies and people talk about mice, and the criticism is if you can't cure cancer in a mouse, you're a moron, basically, because it's pretty easy apparently. But when you start to get to the higher animals, and particularly the humans, it's more difficult. So let's talk about human data and cancer. What do we know? What has been demonstrated to happen in actual human beings with cancer with diet so far?
Well, again, a lot of these are nutritional studies which are epidemiological or observational. So that's the previous work. Let's call that the previous work. And so they look at people's lifestyle and they say, well, people that have more saturated fat in their diet have a higher rate of whatever cancer. Most of that research there's no weight in it, because there's too many variables and they're too hard to control, and the data they're collecting is rotten data because people don't report well on observational studies. How many eggs did you eat a month ago? I don't know. So again, doing these controlled studies is more challenging. There's been a few. There's been one study. The first one was probably done on pancreatic cancer. And here's part of the issue when you're looking at nutritional interventions for cancer is the patients that you're going to be working with are patients that essentially the medical community has given up on. So this is late stage 4. So when we screen for our patients for our study at the Ohio State University, they have to, we have to have some sense they're going to live at least 6 months to a year, but they're just on standard of care, tamoxifen, something like that for their breast cancer. If it's, if it's that type of breast cancer that responds to it. There's some early studies done at Albert Einstein University looking at pancreatic cancer that showed some efficacy there, showed some improvement. This is in a small number of humans. There's some work done in Texas too. Interestingly, a lot of oncologists are now recommending ketogenic diets, but not in an experimental way, just in a clinical way. There's actually very little conclusive evidence at this point that you can say is gold standard randomized controlled trials. That's why we've invested in this trial and hope to show that efficacy. So I'm not the principal investigator on that, so it's not really within my professional scope to talk about the end results, but I can talk about what we're seeing in our lab, and we're seeing when we look at people who are keto adapted and compare their immune cells to those that are not, we're seeing an enhanced response to infection and in fact to tumor, anti-tumor behavior. So let me tell you what we do. What we do is we actually take blood samples from people. We isolate live white blood cells and we type them, and then we challenge those with both a viral and a bacterial challenge. So the viral challenge is herpes simplex 1. And we use E. coli for an E. coli variant for the bacterial challenge. And so we see the response. We see the kinds of cytokines. And cytokines are these, it's the way cells talk to one another through chemicals, right? And it's the way they trigger anti-tumor pathways or antiviral pathways or whatever. And so when we compared these two, we saw a really strong correlation there between people who are keto adapted and antiviral and antibacterial responses. And it seemed to correspond to how well they felt they were committed to a ketogenic diet. This was in fact months after, so it seems to have quite a lasting effect. So what we see is an enhanced anti-inflammatory response, an enhanced type 1 interferon response, and we can also segue into a talk about how that might work on COVID as well. And so then when we looked at the samples, the early samples from the breast cancer studies, we saw again 3 or 4 of the key cytokines were elevated in their response. So in other words, they had an enhanced immune response. When we compare that to the women that those samples came from, we see really quite profound tumor regression. Now, again, I want to caution people, this is not a cure for cancer. We don't know how long this effect lasts. We don't know if you have to stay ketogenic forever. I think it's a healthy lifestyle. I've been doing it for 10 years, so I think it's probably good. So that's how we're approaching it. So we have people on the team looking at the psychosocial aspects, but we're digging down to the cellular molecular mechanisms and looking at what genes are turned on. We're actually using one of the first digital PET scans. It's the first clinical use of a digital PET scan because they have that technology developed at Ohio State. And so we can almost get to the point where we can watch cancer cells metabolizing glucose in real time, which is pretty cool. If we want to again take a step back to that broader view, if you look at cancer as the medical community does for the most part now, they consider it a genetic thing. So either you inherit genes that are turned on that affect these oncogenes that disrupt the normal behavior of the cell and turn it into a cancer cell. The other way to look at it, which Dom D'Agostino and Thomas Seyfried in particular have focused on, is well, maybe it's the mitochondria that are not healthy, and that's causing the genetic changes within the nucleus of the cell. And so what they did were these really cool nuclear transfer experiments with mouse cells, and they took the cancerous nucleus and from a cancer cell and normal nucleus, and they flipped them around. And you'd think if it's a genetic thing that the taking a nucleus from a cancer cell, putting it in a healthy cell would become cancerous because those genes are all turned on. In fact, it's the opposite. The normal cell turns off those genes and returns it to relatively normal health. And these are in embryonic cells too. They're actually able to grow even though they're supposed to be cancer cells. And when you take a healthy nucleus and you put it in a cancer cell, it quickly becomes a cancer cell. It stays that way. So there's the indication that perhaps the start of this is at the mitochondrial level. And if that's the case, then it also fits well with this idea I have of the axis of illness, because faulty mitochondria will also cause other problems like obesity, inflammation, cell senescence, and when those mitochondria become unhealthy, they do all kinds of nasty things within the cell, and if the cells die, sometimes that spreads to neighboring cells and so on. So that's the kind of approach we're taking. Is we're assuming that there's metabolic changes. If you look at cancer as a metabolic tissue, which they used to do in the old days, there's really just three pathways. They're focused on anaerobic metabolism. They really focused on burning glutamate is really the only amino acid that they're dependent on for growth. And then there's a single carbon transfer, which is part of how they make other amino acids from that one. There's also a more acidic microenvironment around cancer cells, so there's a little more detail to it there. But that's it. If you look at it from a genetic perspective, there's like thousands of oncogenes we've identified, and probably tens of thousands of metabolic pathways. And I go to the cancer conferences, and if you go there, they found this metabolic pathway. If they could just stop this, it should cure cancer, and it does. In whatever tissue they're looking at, wherever they got that compound from, it'll cure cancer for a while. And then the cancer cells, they've been around for millions of years too. They're adaptable, and they'll just figure a way around it. And that's the problem with a lot of these new treatments. They're very sexy treatments that use, immunotherapies or protein therapies or monoclonal antibodies that attack particular specific points in a pathway. Is they tend to work really well, but for 6 weeks or 6 months, and then you get this recurrence because the cancer is now adapted around it, because the cancer cells are growing fast too. That's a broad generalization, but so if you look at it as a genetic problem and expression of genes, it's potentially beneficial, and it has worked in many cases, but really, really complicated. If you look at it from a metabolic perspective, even though metabolism is complicated, it's just really those three pathways. The anaerobic metabolism or fermentation is the main route. So they use glucose as a fuel. Cancer cells concentrate glucose about 100 to 200 times normal. Again, they use glutamate, and they've looked at ways of blocking glutamate, but you need glutamate in your other cells, so that's kind of tricky. And this other single carbon transfer, which is a little bit more complicated, but so that's the basic principle, and that's kind of where we're at, and that's kind of what we've found at this point as far as cancer goes.
Just to the sort of nuclear transfer studies are interesting, and I guess I would say there's something in the cytosol, perhaps, and there's probably other clues that show mitochondria due to the the type of respiration that's going on and the changes in metabolism. But it could be something else in the cytosol, perhaps, maybe, I don't know. It could be that that's going on. Yeah.
There's about 100,000 different proteins in the cytosol, and we know what about half of them maybe do. Right. So there's a lot else going on. But we can correlate that for metabolic health pretty well with chronic disease, if you want to do that. And as I said, people are starting to look at that now. We're not one of them, but I think that's where research is going. There's a number of new studies going on there. What have you heard, Dr. Baker, from people? Have you had people in your community that have had cancer that have been able to? I've seen a number of, not huge numbers, but I've seen certain people, like people with non-solid tumors, so some of the leukemias, lymphomas, where they've kind of halted that. I've had some people that have gone through chemotherapy and they've had minimal symptoms. So it's mitigated side effects for sure. So they don't find the profound nausea, they don't get really sick. So we've had some people that, we're going to interview a guy named Andrew Scarborough, who you probably are aware of. He's been sort of remission, he's been in remission for 7-8 years from, I think it was an astrocytoma. So, we've got a handful of people that have either, halted progression. Some people have seen some regression in that. So it's, again, but it's not, formalized studies, just collections of individual anecdotes, which, a lot of people criticize that, but it's a starting point, Well, that's where we get our ideas in science.
Right,
it comes from anecdotal evidence.
Right. It's a hypothesis generator, and then you just have to test it. I'm interested, because you did mention, cancer in the immune system, and most people don't maybe many people don't realize that our immune system is continuously surveilling for cancer cells and killing them. And, when you alluded to, viral infections like COVID-19, I mean, I'm literally breathing in millions of viruses right now as I'm standing here, as I'm sitting there. My gut, I think I read today, our gut transfers something like 100 billion bacteria, viral particles every day through our gut. And, we deal with it. We take care of it and we get rid of that. So how do we, like you kind of alluded to, does changing diet potentially have a role in mitigating or protecting us from infectious disease like coronavirus? Is there something to that?
Yeah. Well, interesting and timely, because I was giving a talk on our research at Low Carb Denver. I don't know if any of your community have been there, but this was back in mid-March. That was kind of a auspicious time. In fact, Friday the 13th was kind of the day everything shut down, and I was the keynote the morning of Saturday the 14th. And at the end, I was talking about cancer, but at the end, I figured I should say what we know about the immune system and how it might affect COVID. So the answer to that is maybe. Of course, with one specific virus, you'd need to do those studies to provide the conclusive evidence. But what we can do is look at what happens again to the immune system, and this is partly from my colleague at the Cancer Agency. His conclusion, this is Jerry Crystal, his conclusion is that what you want in a response is a strong type 1 interferon response. That is an antiviral spread kind of response, because interferon is something that viral infected cells, again, one of these cytokines, that it spreads to other cells to say, don't let this thing in. There's an infectious agent in our midst. And if you don't get that strong response, there tends to be a more dramatic cytokine response later, which can lead to this cytokine storm. And again, there's a lot of different, there's dozens of different cytokines, but it's IL-6, interleukin 6 seems to be particularly important in triggering this cytokine storm. And what that does is lead to dramatic inflammation within the lungs. So the lungs actually essentially stop working because they're either filled with fluid or there's too much interference with the gas exchange. And it's interesting because in most other, like pneumonias and so on, it starts sort of up higher, so you're really aware that you're having trouble breathing. Whereas for some reason with COVID, it's more deep in the lungs. And so people can have really quite severe pneumonia, fluid filling in their lungs, and they don't know it because the upper part is still working pretty well. So this is an unusual part of a little aside there. But we do know a little bit about what ketogenic diets do. And some of this is work on mice, where we've shown mice were able this was actually with an influenza virus, which is obviously not the same thing as COVID, which is a coronavirus. So, but this was work done at Yale, and they showed that, two populations of mice, and they were given an influenza strain or variant that was fatal, 100% fatal to mice. So in the control group, they all die when you give them this virus. They keto adapted another group, and none of them died. And so what they saw again was this strong type 1 response, and which mitigates the cytokine storm to some degree. So that's with influenza on mice. And again, you've already mentioned extrapolating to humans is sometimes folly. But a lot of these immune pathways are very, very highly conserved in an evolutionary sense. What that means is that if it's really important for your survival, you keep that as you're evolving. And so you see similar immune systems in all mammals, and in fact, very similar immune system even in all animals in some circumstances. So the other one was when SARS came about almost 20 years ago now. That was the first severe acute respiratory syndrome. That's what SARS is. So the COVID today is SARS as well, but it's SARS-CoV-2. It's a new strain of that. So the interesting thing is both of those use that S protein, the spike protein, and it attaches to something called the ACE2 receptor. ACE is for angiotensin converting enzyme. And ACE, don't confuse this with ACE1, which is a target of ramipril and other things to help control blood pressure because it affects what we call the renin-angiotensin system. That's all an aside, but related. It's an ACE2 receptor, which kind of works antagonistically with ACE1. And what we see in studies looking at SARS and in ketogenic diets was a reduction in the ACE2 on the actual respiratory cells. So there's not as many targets for the virus to attach to, and we call that a downregulation. So if, and this was in humans, so if in fact we have a human downregulation of ACE2 receptors as well as a strong type 1 interferon response, you can extrapolate and say, in theory, this should provide additional protection to COVID. And as we know with COVID, some people get it and they can be seemingly healthy and they're in the hospital a few days later. Other people can get it and they don't even know they have it. And they can have quite a strong viral load and not even know they have it. So that, as a scientist says, well, what's the difference between these people? And I'm wondering if it has to do with these sorts of pathways. And I've asked on my social media circles, if there's anybody that's maybe in your group today, somebody can put in the chat, if there's anybody here that has been keto adapted since before COVID that tested positive for COVID, I'd love to hear from you because I'd love to hear what that experience was. But I'm not seeing a lot of it. So, and again, so this talk I did in Denver, if you just look up, David Harper and low carb Denver, it'll pop up on YouTube. It's had a lot of views, but I also asked the audience, which are mostly physicians and nutritionists and dietitians, how many of you are keto adapted and have been for a while? And, the majority of the audience put up their hand. And I said, how many of you found that you're getting less colds and flus and things since you've been keto adapted? All the same people put up their hands. Anybody here today noticing that they're, yeah, okay, same thing. And here's the other thing I asked is, how many of you felt at one point that you were for sure coming down with something? You get that kind of feverish feeling that really, oh no, this is my last day at work. I know I'm going to be sick tomorrow. I feel it like you come down, and then you wake up the next day and you're fine. How many of you have had that experience? Yeah, see, and so that feeling is actually the gamma interferon. That's what gamma interferon does. It makes you feel like you have the flu. So people that have had to take interferon for some types of skin cancer, for example, they'll tell you, well, you got to be on this for 2 years and you're going to feel like you got the flu every day for 2 years. It's awful. So that feeling that you're coming down with something is actually a response to the production of that interferon, which will hopefully prevent that respiratory infection from taking hold and prevent you from getting sick. And I've experienced, I've been keto adapted for 10 years now, I guess, pretty close, 9 years. Haven't had as much as a sniffle in that time. And I'm a pretty healthy guy. I don't usually get a lot, but I would get, a cold or a couple of colds a year like everybody else. I get a flu shot, so I don't get the flu typically. But haven't had a sniffle, and I guarantee you, when I was in Denver, I was exposed to COVID because when we were trying to get out of the airport, there was thousands of people packed cheek to jowl, trying to make their way to planes on those little trains that go out there in Denver, and I did the isolation when I got home and all that, and I haven't been tested for antibodies, but I suspect I was probably exposed. So. I don't know if there's anybody. I'm seeing that some people are saying that haven't had a headache, they haven't been sick. Roommate was positive, and they never got it. So I'm wondering. I see Ashley kind of putting her hand up there. Maybe long shot. Do you think that gamma interferon has anything to do with keto flu? No, actually, that's a very good question. And the keto flu is a misnomer because, of course, flu is influenza, Ashley. And I know you know that. But we've learned that the keto flu is more a dizzy, nausea, lightheadedness, cranky. It manifests in different ways. Some people get constipated. Some people get diarrhea. It seems to be more related to getting salts right, getting the salt balance right. Because one of the things about a keto adapted diet or a carnivore diet is that you're not eating processed food. When you don't eat processed food, you're not eating a lot of sodium at all. So it's important to actually add sodium to your diet to make sure that you're getting enough, but also magnesium and calcium and other salts too. So in my book, BioDiet, I have a whole section in there about getting the salts right. And my general feeling there, I don't know what you think, Dr. Baker, my general feeling is your kidneys are designed to monitor this stuff. So give your body more than it needs, or at least enough. You can, obviously you don't want to go crazy, but if you feel like you want something salty, you need some salt, right? And get some potassium, get some calcium, get all of that, which of course is all in meat. And the one thing you probably have to add on a carnivore diet is make sure you get enough salt. So you can probably use that salt shaker pretty liberally. And then, if you have a little bit too much, your kidneys will sort it out. That's what they're designed to do. So.
Yeah, I think salt has been unfairly vilified. It's usually a proxy for processed food. Salt consumption is. So I think that's something.
Half of the salt you get is from bread. Bread has a ton of salt in it, and people don't realize that. But that's how you get different textures of bread. Is really through salt. So yeah.
Yeah, to answer your question, my personal experience, I know several physicians that are doing either carnivore or carnivore style diet, and that have had COVID, and the course has been pretty mild generally. And they're obviously more likely to be exposed as physicians are in the hospital all day long. And so that's been my experience. I also, I used to, because I worked in a hospital, was exposed to stuff all day long, every day. I would get 2-3 colds a year. They would last several days to a couple of weeks. I kind of feel miserable. And now almost never, if I do, it's a 24-hour kind of thing, and it goes away. And so that's been my experience too. And so hopefully that, does diet have a role in that? I mean, certainly it's plausible. Let me ask you about neurodegenerative stuff, because you kind of alluded to that. And I think that's another big thing I think we're seeing, and I don't know that people realize this, but I think we have an epidemic of dementia coming. With all this diabetes, it's going to be followed by dementia. So what do we know with regards to nutritional strategies in dementia? Does a ketogenic diet have a significant role in either mitigating, and I know you kind of alluded to it with MCT-oil and Alzheimer's, but what do we know about that as far as can it help out with that stuff?
Yeah, the work on with the fMRI is Stephen Cunnane at University of Sherbrooke. I don't know if you know of him, but he does great work on that. So again, given my general view of these things, is all of these diseases are the same thing, manifesting themselves in different ways. So I think cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's are all just different manifestations of poor metabolic health. That's the root cause. And so if we want to look at Alzheimer's or dementia, but probably Alzheimer's is it's 80% of most of the dementia. That's effectively an insulin-resistant brain. And I think it was De La Monte at Brown University who coined the term type 3 diabetes. Alzheimer's is really type 3 diabetes. It's an insulin resistance of the brain. And, unlike other tissues like, fat cells and muscle cells, you don't need insulin to get glucose into brain cells. And that's because brain cells can't burn amino acids and fats. So they're kind of dependent on glucose, and I would argue ketones. But the insulin is still required in the brain in order to, so it's not like a key to get in the car, but it kind of works in the fuel line to make sure that the fuel can be metabolized appropriately. And if you have too much insulin over time, of course, all your tissues can become insulin resistant, which means that internally or externally, you downregulate the receptors for the insulin, and when you do that, it's kind of the analogy I use in the book is kind of like you probably have a relative who's older or have had one that's older, and they're starting to go deaf, they're starting to go hard of hearing, and you go into their house or their apartment and the TV's really loud, and you go, wow, TV's, because they need it that loud just to hear it. And of course, making loud noise just makes the deafness worse. And over time, you need, more and more loudness. So same sort of thing when you're responding to insulin. If there's too much insulin, your cells will start to down-regulate the number of receptors because they don't want to over-respond to that insulin signal. And so when they have fewer receptors, when they do need it, they're less responsive. So they become insulin resistant. So your body produces more insulin in response, and that just makes it worse, right? Because now, now when that insulin is there, you'll downregulate more. So it progressively becomes what we call insulin resistance, which progressively becomes diabetes. I mean, at some point we just say, when it's over this level of blood sugar on various tests, then you're diabetic, but you're essentially pre-diabetic, for a long time before that, maybe as long as 10 years. And if you look for it, you can see the signs of this work. And I have some colleagues here at UBC, University of British Columbia, that are working actually on that pre-diabetic state and what's happening before we define it as diabetes. And you can see the effects of diet, that high carbohydrate diet, which leads to what we call hyperinsulinemia, too much insulin in the blood, which leads to insulin resistance. So I would view the brain in that respect, Dr. Baker, is like any other tissue. It's an insulin-resistant brain, and it manifests as what we call Alzheimer's disease, which is in response to the poor metabolic health of those cells and the inflammation that results. You get these tau proteins, and you get the beta amyloid plaques and so on, that are characteristic of Alzheimer's. But it's interesting. They've done some post-mortem studies comparing brains of people who had Alzheimer's and who didn't. And this was actually covered on 60 Minutes. Some of you might have seen it. It was a year ago or so. And what they did was they got these panels to look at the brains of these people post-mortem and decide by the presence of these, mostly beta amyloid plaques and so on, whether they thought they would have Alzheimer's or not. But before that, they'd been studying the patients themselves and diagnosing it. And it turned out that the correlation wasn't really very strong there. So there were lots of people that would, they say for sure this person has Alzheimer's based on their brain pathology, but in fact, they were functioning completely normally. And other people that had seemingly very severe Alzheimer's that had no clinical signs in their brain. So there may be more to it, again, than we're looking at. And I think if we look at it, rather than these sort of gross anatomy things like what the brain looks like, if we look at it at the cellular molecular level, Alzheimer's is an insulin-resistant brain. So I would agree with Dr. Delamonte. It's a type 3 diabetes, and so it's related, and therefore can be treated with diet.
Yeah, I've seen some evidence, and I can't remember if it's fMRI or PET scans, showing that you can kind of predict, even like in the age of 30s, you can see this sort of insulin-resistant brain developing, and these people are likely to progress into, some sort of dementia. Somebody has asked a question about Parkinson's. I know you alluded to that a little bit. Do we have any decent evidence to show that diet has a role in Parkinson's?
Yes. Again, there are a number of neurological conditions, one of which is Parkinson's. I'm not involved in those studies myself, but again, it's anecdotal that people have responded well to ketogenic diets and to carnivore diets in particular for Parkinson's. Parkinson's, is a destruction of a particular type of dopamine producing cells. And, the treatment is give people dopamine, L-Dopa, and, it alleviates the symptoms, but the disease tends to progress. And so the problem with neural tissue is it doesn't divide. You don't get new neural tissue except in the hippocampus. So, if you lose the cells, you tend to lose them permanently. But other conditions, other neurological conditions, autism, people have amazing stories of people that have responded well to ketogenic diets. Autism has a lot to do with magnesium metabolism, and magnesium is something we focus on, and other things, but that's one. So again, is the insulin resistance affecting Parkinson's? I don't know. Would inflammation make Parkinson's worse? Almost surely. And of course, if you're obese, you make those two things worse as well. So, but I think it's pretty early days on that one. Another one, is epilepsy, and we know we've known for 100 years that ketogenic diets are particularly good for some forms of epilepsy. And about 25% of people will respond really well. About 50% of people respond well. About 25% of people, it's a virtual cure. They don't need to take any medication for it. And of course, the Charlie Foundation is promoting that, and it was rediscovered at Johns Hopkins University, and it's been used. Was used there as a frontline standard of care, and now over 200 different places around the world. It's used as a standard of care now for epileptic children in particular. And so what's happening there? I think it has to do with the stability of the neural membrane and probably the arachidonic acid levels in that membrane. And this is something, an opinion I share with Jeff Volek is we think there's something going on there that affects the stability or instability of the membrane's bioelectric activity that's dependent on arachidonic acid levels, which can vary on ketogenic diets. So would that affect Parkinson's? Perhaps. Still early days on that one, though.
And certainly I appreciate your willingness to look at these communities and to inspire you for sources of hypothesis. And that's what I've done. I said, well, these people doing carnivore, they're all getting healthy, and maybe there's something there, where the other people tend to dismiss, the experience of the community, which I think is this kind of a faulty way to go about science. Interestingly, on autism, there is a group of people they call themselves the autistic carnivores, 1,000 of them or so on a Facebook group, and they're reporting pretty good success with autism. I know there was, and I know this is like name that disease type of thing, but there's a bunch of people are asking about multiple sclerosis or MS. Any comments on MS and diet? Is there anything that we can talk about on that?
Yeah, MS is a funny one. People further north tend to get it at a higher amount. Out in Europe, they call it the Canadian disease because it's very prominent in Canada, especially Canadians of Scottish heritage, of which I am one. Again, that's an external. It seems to be an external scarring, recurrent scarring that occurs that affects the myelin sheath around the neurons. So is it being studied? Yes, I know there's about 3 dozen different conditions that are being studied for the possibility of therapeutic benefits of ketogenic diets. And I should mention, up until very recently, the only way to do these studies was off the side of your desk or with private funding. The federal funding agencies were unwilling, both in Canada and the US and elsewhere, to fund studies on ketogenic diets because it was contrary to what they were arguing was a healthy diet. So I guess they didn't feel like they could tell people not to eat fat and fund studies that show that high-fat diets actually improve health at the same time. So our study is funded by the John and Lottie Hecht Foundation, for which we're really grateful. So, but I'm seeing now, all over the world, just an explosion in the academic community of people doing very serious studies. Now, it's always easier to do animal studies because you can control variables much more there. So a lot of the human information, one of the great things, I guess, about the internet and social media and what you're doing today is to just bypass that whole system of bias in terms of funding, in terms of publication. I mean, if I mention Ansel Keys, people probably start turning off their cameras. A person who might be responsible for more premature deaths than anybody, because he basically bullied everybody else out of the business that didn't believe what he believed. And unfortunately, this happens in science, is you get these sort of, and it happens in nutrition now. I mean, there's people that are just avid vegans that just want to drum everybody else that disagree with them, out of the ability to say what they want. So through social media and through the internet, we can actually talk right to people. And I would caution people there, though, that comes with some risk too, because you have to be sure you're listening to people who know what they're talking about and who aren't trying to sell you anything. And on that, I am trying to sell you, my book, BioDiet, but that's only to help your health, and I'm not making any money off of selling books. You don't do that. But there are there's lots of muck out there on the internet outside of cat videos. There's lots of nutritional muck out there, and lots of people claiming to have knowledge that they don't have. And so that critical thinking is important as well when you're doing this. But developing these communities of shared interest, and having people like yourselves leading the conversation, I think is absolutely critical. And So when people ask me, well, there's not enough long-term evidence for ketogenic diets, carnivore diets, whatever you want, I just say, listen, you know, I'm 60. I don't have 30 years to wait to know that I'm right. The people doing the science are usually 15 to 20 years ahead of the clinical practice. It takes usually, the average is 17 years to get new scientific discoveries into daily clinical practice. But what we're seeing now is an acceleration of that. So as you're saying, you have colleagues and physicians and so on that are prescribing now as a medical intervention ketogenic diets, and that's wonderful. It used to take a lot longer because all the professional bodies had to recognize it, and it couldn't be, you know, contrary to your standard of care and all that sort of legal stuff that could get you in trouble. And so now there's brave people, and there have been physicians elsewhere in the world that have been charged criminally for simple things like telling people it's okay to eat a ketogenic diet. That to me is a bit of an issue.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I want to do just one sort of thing that when we talk about a ketogenic diet, you know, and there's a lot of definitions, you know, I mean, there's a lot of ways to practice a ketogenic diet. You could eat Diet Coke and, you know, and corn oil and be on a ketogenic diet. And so, but the way, you know, there's something called the glucose ketone index, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Yep. I mean, Safe Food's a big proponent of that. So how do you, when you're doing this in a prescriptive way for people with disease, what are you finding is, you know, like, I mean, there's a lot of ways. I mean, you know, you can restrict carbs, you can fast, you can exercise. How do you, or you can dump MCT oil in there. How do you find that the best way to sort of produce keto, it doesn't matter which way you get into ketosis. Do they have differential effects to say exercise trump fasting, or does fasting trump exercising, or how do you put all that together?
Well, it's a great question. It's a great question because, you know, one of the organizations I'm involved with is called the Institute of Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition. And, sorry, Ashley is a Nashville, Vanderbilt here now. I have lots of family in Nashville. Where are you? I hope to get back there really soon, but sadly we're not allowed to cross the border right now. But yeah, well, Nashville is where George, what was George's last name? He did a lot of he was one of the guys who was bullied out of his career basically by Ansel Keys, passed away a couple of years ago. But so how do you get started? Well, I think you have to do it on an individual basis. You have to try yourself. The most important thing, so here's what I do. You know, I have like steps in what I suggest. The first thing you should do is have a conversation with your physician, with your family practice physician. And there's two reasons for that. One is that there are some usually pretty rare conditions for which a ketogenic diet would be contraindicated because it could be dangerous. These are really rare metabolic disorders to do with, you know, carnitine, metabolism, and so on. And the second thing is to take some measurements, you know, be a scientist yourself, you know, and there's the easiest measurement is just, you know, what's your waist and what's your weight. I like to focus on waist size mostly. And that'll tell you whether the diet's working or not, because when you start burning fat, you'll start to burn that mid-abdominal fat. When I did this, I lost about 27 pounds of abdominal fat. And if you looked at me, you know, I might have looked a little bellinaceous, my wife calls it, but I was never overweight even or obese, but certainly had, you know, was putting on weight. And so that just, you know, as I metabolized it, it disappeared in about 12 weeks, it tends to do. I think to get into ketosis, I recommend a slow approach. So here's the first thing is you need to get sugar out of your diet. Fructose does all kinds of nasty things. You know, Lustig has written a lot about that. You know, in the standard U.S. diet, I assume most of the folks here from the U.S., you know, kids are getting like 30% of their calories from sugar on a daily basis because it's in so many processed foods. And half of that sugar is fructose, which is a known hepatotoxin. So we talk about, you know, getting, you know, wash your vegetables because they'll have, you know, pesticides on them, or we talk about the importance of organic food. So, and then your kids are eating, you know, 1/6 of their calories is a known poison. That's just crazy. So get sugar out of your diet. And then, you know, some people ask me, is it okay to go low carb as opposed to ketogenic? I think ketogenic is a better metabolic state to be in. but you have to decide for your lifestyle and your family and so on, where you want to be. I think ketones are healthy, and the ratio you're talking about is about 1-to-1. So you have, you burn a molecule of beta hydroxybutyrate for every molecule of glucose you burn. And that seems to be a pretty good ratio to maintain all this stuff. But low carb is better than high carb. What you shouldn't do is mix high glycemic index anything with saturated fats, because that'll raise your blood sugar. The fat's then in your blood, and it doesn't know where to go, and it's not going to be burned. So that's the kind of the intermediate thing that I'm uncomfortable with. If people say, well, I'm going to reduce sugar, but I'm still going to have like pizza and ice cream once a week. And I go, yeah, but you know what? You're just never going to be in ketosis if you do that. And you can eat all the MCT oil you want. It's not going to make up for the difference, right? So the exogenous ketones, that's a whole other story. But I think, again, getting sugar out of your body, lowering your intake of high glycemic index foods, and I talk about that in the book too, and just getting processed food out of your diet. Again, 50% of the calories that are consumed in the United States are hyper processed foods. And I don't believe in like dirty keto, like you say, corn oil and sugar-free pop is rotten. It's not good food. I don't even think corn is something that humans should eat, frankly, but certainly not corn oil. Vegetable oils, except for olive oil and the monounsaturated ones, and avocado oil, vegetable oils should be avoided. Good old butter, grass-fed butter is fantastic. It's high in omega-3 and low in omega-6, and omega-3 is anti-inflammatory, omega-6 is inflammatory, and vegetable oils are full of omega-6. So I don't believe in dirty keto. I don't believe in cheat days. I think that's just an excuse to eat food that is not good for you, and again, it's a poor decision. What I believe in is you should, realize you should prepare yourself both mentally, prepare your environment physically by getting rid of things that you might be tempted to eat, and commit. You have to commit to at least a couple of months to know if this is going to work for you. And while you're doing that, learn some new recipes, buy new foods. There's lots of good keto products out there, but I like just plain old food you can get from the grocery store, in the vegetable aisles and the meat section and that sort of thing. I do eat a lot of vegetables, but I don't eat a lot of fruit, a little bit of berries, because there's some phytochemicals in there. You can tell me, I'll take one step further, because I think this is a safe crowd to say this within. I think the vegan thing is a political movement. I don't think it's really about health. It may be about animal rights. I'm with you on that. I'm a biologist. I love animals, and I think we should treat them fairly and humanely we can. It's not an economic argument. You can do much better financially on a ketogenic diet actually than on a plant-based processed food diet. So it's not a health thing. It's not an economic thing. And at the end, healthy, you can't live on a vegan diet. You will die, of pernicious anemia or something else. So you're going to have to supplement. And it's kind of a good way of saying, well, maybe this isn't the best thing for me. So you can be vegan and keto, but you're going to be eating a lot of soy and, olive oil, which is probably fine. The soy, if you're a woman, it's an estrogen disruptor. So, yeah, but I think that's, so the other question you asked me was about the intermittent fasting. I think if you're keto adapted, you can try it if you want. I don't think it adds anything. I think if you're in a healthy state of nutritional ketosis, intermittent fasting isn't going to help that much. What it might do is interfere with the getting what we call a balanced diet, which is full nutrition. Because the problem is if you're fasting, first of all, you shouldn't fast more than a couple of days. I'm an adherent to the thrifty gene theory, as my friend Stephen Cunnane is, that after a couple of days, you're going to start triggering these thrifty genes, which are going to bias you towards fat storage when you start eating again. And we're pretty confident that there's a good metabolic argument for that one. And once you turn on those thrifty genes, by the way, they don't turn off again. They can turn on for years. So if you are fasting, please don't fast more than 48 hours. That could be problematic. If you are and you're getting success with it, again, it's personalized. If it's working for you, that's great. My wife's played around with that. She does more than, I think the 18-hour window, 18-hour fast window on a daily basis, I think it's good. My colleague at the cancer agency says it's good. 1 meal a day, people seem to have a lot of success with that. The good thing about 1 meal a day is if you're eating meat, you're gonna have a much greater chance of getting that full nutrition, that balanced diet. If you're a vegan and you're going to try 1 meal a day, you're going to be deficient in all kinds of things. There's just too much food you'd have to eat to get all those nutrients. So I'm just there. I've told you my position on all kinds of controversial things. That's just where I stand, because I think that's where the science is right now.
Yeah, I think veganism has been co-opted by the processed food companies, and they find it. They look at it as a sort of a way to convince people to eat more processed food, as cheap profitable food, I think is what we're seeing, and they're gonna label it as plant-based and environmentally friendly, and it's going to be very misleading, but it's going to ultimately result in tremendous profits for them. So I think that's what we're seeing with that, and that's why they're getting so much play right now, so much advertising and so much marketing being pushed behind that. But most, throughout history, there's only a few percentage of people that are willing to actually do that for any length of time, and probably because only a few percentage of them can actually figure out how to manage it and maintain some semblance of health. But
if you look at sorry, I was just going to say, if you look at the history of where the original U.S. dietary guidelines came from, it was way back with George McGovern. When he was in charge of the Senate committee looking at nutrition, and he hired, I think his name was Mo Tern, who was he was a political newspaper writer who was a vegetarian, and he just thought that we should not be eating meat and it's cruel and that sort of thing, and that's where that all started. One guy that has no science background, no nutritional background, somehow essentially wrote the U.S. dietary guidelines, which for the most part we still stick to today. And that's the danger in that political interference in your health. So here's an ethical question: is what if a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet is better for your health and your family's health, but it's more harmful to the environment? What's the ethical choice there? And I think it's a false dichotomy, but it's proposed all the time. I think the real problem there is, we all know, when I was born, there were 3 billion people on the planet. We're getting close to 8. It took us 2 million years to get to 3 billion people, and it took a couple of hundred years to get from 1 billion to 3 billion. Within my lifetime, we've more than doubled. We'll probably triple the human population. That's the problem. That's the root cause of the problem for the environment. It's not people making healthy choices about choosing animal products, which are very healthy for you, over processed foods. And by the way, the processed food industry is the largest transactional business in the world. It's $7 trillion a year, because people buy food every day. Not in terms of its overall value, that's real estate, but in terms of the transactional value, it's the biggest business in the world. The processed food industry is about $3 trillion worth of that on an annual basis, and it's controlled mostly by about 12 companies, and you know who they are. And those 12 companies are using plant-based stuff and they pepper it with sugar and salt and stuff to make it taste good, and they literally play with your, is it what's his name, Moscone, the guy in Minnesota? Moskowitz. Yeah, thank you. Moscone is the pool player. Same state though. They tease this stuff even regionally so that you can't stop eating it. So we have, a medical system where our physicians get virtually no nutritional training, and then we have a food system that's dominated by companies that don't care about your health, and somehow we end up with a health crisis that's nutritionally based, which is the obesity, diabetes, other chronic disease crisis we see ourselves in today. And the great news is there's a solution, which you've all found. There's a solution, which is pay attention to the science, and question the message you're getting from the policymakers. They are responsible, and it's same thing in Canada, by the way. But the problem in Canada is our Health Canada is it's lousy with vegans, right? So they just have a political feeling about food that they impose on us through their policies. And I would hate to see they're talking about taxes on meat because it affects the environment, like a carbon tax on meat. I just think that's absolutely politicizing a health issue, and it's dangerous. And I think frankly that's unethical.
I don't disagree at all with that, but I'm afraid we're going to be having to face that. I think that's going to be brought up, and whether it goes through or not, it's going to depend on, how many people you convince one way or the other. And I think what's worse for the environment, and I make this point that I think a sick population is bad for the environment. And I think that's probably, in the United States, healthcare industry is 10% of our greenhouse gases, if you want to use that metric. And some people would like to use other metrics. But the problem is we let people define the outcomes and the measurements they want to define. And so they'll say, well, this is greenhouse gases per calorie produced. But you're saying, well, let's look at, say, greenhouse gases per critical lysine, critical zinc, critical nutrients, and then the numbers look very different. And when you start taking out the fact that water consumption is mostly rainwater, which would fall regardless of whether a cow's there or not, we've sort of let those people sort of dictate what the outcomes are. They've set the goalposts where they want them to be, and how dare you try to question what the outcomes are. So, well,
again, you're right. It is a false dichotomy. And if you look at, about the death zone in the Gulf of Mexico, because, here's another environmental thing. All throughout the Midwest, you have all these cornfields and soy fields and so on. The soil is becoming so depleted. The forecast is that within 20 or 30 years, the global soil will be depleted of nutrients. So we'll have to add them in the soil. But what they're doing is putting tons of fertilizer on and growth factors and so on, which gets into the Mississippi River, which comes out through Louisiana, and then there's this huge death zone around there. So does that count? Because if you're as opposed to in Canada here, where we have these cattle ranchers, and the cows just take off up into the hills. That's not arable land, and they do what cows do, and then at the end of them, we eat them. I'm not seeing an environmental problem with that, but again, I think. In the end, the question is, how are we going to feed 8 billion people? And I think the question is, we need to start talking about when are we going to put a cap on that, and how do we do that? It's only ever been tried once in China, and it becomes, a problem. And it may be a problem we can't solve, Dr. Baker. But I think what you do need to do is look after your friends and the people close to me and the people and that's why I wrote BioDiet. If people want to have a look more, biodiet.org is our website. But if you want to, I'm just trying to help the people I can. And my mother died of breast cancer when I was a kid. So, that's sort of the first in line for me is if I can stop people from getting really sick, and help sick people get better. Job done for me. That's what I'm trying to do. And those other problems are for us to solve collectively. And I don't think, pointing fingers and name calling and that kind of conspiracy theorist stuff that comes at us all the time is how do we feed 8 billion patients? I love that one. Who put that up there? David, thank you for that.
Well, I'll tell you what, this has been wonderful. Maybe we can get you to come back down the road a little bit when you find a little more about the research. We'd love to hear about it. This has been fascinating.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but a couple people are asking for email. Please, if you want to get in touch with me, on the website, it's biodiet.org. So BioDiet, sorry, I'm a little plug here. BioDiet's the book, so biodiet.org. And you can just email me straight through the website there. I'd be happy to hear from any of the community here, and please keep in touch. And the book's available, in all formats and all that sort of thing. But love to come back, Dr. Baker. Thank you very much for having me today. And please keep up the good work. And all of you out there, we need to speak with a calm and deliberate voice about this, that our health is our utmost. That's our non-negotiable, is our health. So other problems we'll have to solve through other ways, but our health comes first, and the health of our family. And then we're willing to engage in how we solve those other problems.
Yeah, and our health is dependent upon our food. So
Absolutely. You can't outrun your fork. And what's on the end of your fork is the most important health decision you make every day.
all right. Well, Dr. Harper, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I'm sure we'll be in touch and we'll maybe talk to you down the road. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a good day. See you tomorrow.